Hello and welcome to the fourth installment of our series about economics. As you can see, this video is going to be about trade, um, political economy in the international market. And so where are we supposed to start really with trade? Well, the place to start is with David Ricardo. David Ricardo was really the first person to popularize an overarching theory about trade. Before David Ricardo, each government had their various opinions about trade, but he really was responsible for sort of establishing the primacy of a concept as sort of the benchmark of economic policy, rather than just the pure moment-to-moment pragmatism that any government would have pursued. Okay, so David Ricardo's most lasting contribution to economic thought remains the principle of comparative advantage. This principle is the bedrock of free trade theory. So here's how David Ricardo's theory goes. Say that the cost for producing a barrel of wine in Portugal is 80 labor hours, and the cost for producing a cut of cloth is 90 labor hours. In England, the cost for producing a barrel of wine is 120 labor hours, and that for a cut of cloth is 100. Ricardo says that both countries would benefit from trade. Imagine, Portugal can devote 170 hours of work to its industries and get 1 unit of wine and 1 unit of cloth, and England could devote 220 hours of work to its industries and also get 1 unit of wine and 1 unit of cloth. So far, with neither country trading with each other, the total supply of wine and cloth is 2 and 2. Say now they decide to engage in trade with each other, and only produce what each of them is most efficient at. For England, that would be cloth, and for Portugal, wine. England now spends 220 hours making cloth, resulting in a global supply of 2.2 units of cloth, and Portugal now spends 170 hours making wine, resulting in a global supply of 2.125 units of wine. The total supply of goods globally is now greater. Okay, so the hours being used there are just basically the sum of the hours that would normally be used making the two types of products. Now they're just making one. So this is the whole idea behind free trade, is that if a country just specializes in what it is best at or most efficient at producing, then the total supply of goods globally will be greater, and so there will be a higher degree of prosperity. Okay, so right, each country can now enjoy a higher consumption of goods thanks to the benefits of free trade. So this sounds like a pretty good idea, right? If everyone just produces what they're best at producing, then the global supply of goods would be greater than if they divided their efforts among various different projects, which maybe they weren't very good at. Okay, so this theory is really the basis for the primacy of the free trade concept within sort of I guess, the intellectual spheres. I mean, it's generally admitted or agreed upon among economists and among economic publications and newspapers and all those types of things that free trade is the right policy, and people who are against free trade are uneducated and don't understand the Ricardian principle of comparative advantage. Well, there are a couple problems with this theory. One of the big problems with Ricardian trade theory is that it is a primarily agricultural model. Of course, the English can't make wine very well because they're just not suited to it. This is a fact of life that will never change. One might say it is an immutable fact. So, England will never get any better at growing wine because it's just a cold, soggy island, and they just don't have the climate for it. And same thing with Sweden and peaches. Sweden will never be able to grow peaches the way Sicily can. This sort of trade model makes sense in a world, Ricardo's world, where most economic product is agricultural. But what about the modern world, where most economic product is manufactured or artificed in some way? So yeah, just because there are problems with Ricardo's trade theory, it's not really necessarily an indictment of Ricardo as an economist. It could be more that his trade theory is maladapted to our current system of economics, because the economy in his age would have been much more agriculturally based, whereas in our time, agricultural produce really is not the most important sector of the economy, I guess. It's definitely not the biggest. So here's an example, computer chips. Does South Korea inherently have any advantages in the production of computer hardware? Yes, it has an educated and skilled population with much investment already dedicated toward the production of computer hardware. But is there anything inherent to the country that makes computer hardware its a priori most competitive industry? In other words, is there any reason that computer chips could not be produced in the USA in the same quantity and quality that South Korea produces them? Yes, there are educated and skilled workers and the entrenched investments in South Korea, but these are not immutable facts of the economy. Essentially, we could say that South Korea is better at making computer chips because it's better at making computer chips, because it has computer chip factories staffed with skilled workers. This doesn't mean that it is impossible for the US to also have computer chip factories staffed with skilled workers, does it? It's not an immutable fact of the American economy. Yeah, so I mean, imagine, when we say it's not an immutable fact of the American economy, we're saying that it's not an inherent feature to the country the way that climate or location or soil conditions or any of these sort of agricultural conditions are inherent, because people can change. They can be educated, and capital can change also. It can be increased or reduced depending on many different factors. So we can start to see now how the Ricardian trade theory might easily lend itself to some circular logic regarding the competitiveness of the country in a certain industry. South Korea is competitive in computer hardware production because it is competitive in computer hardware production. And the US is not competitive, so it should not try to become competitive in computer hardware production. That's basically the logic of Ricardian trade theory, which is, if you're not good at something, then you shouldn't try to become good at something, because it's just a waste of your time. Right, so what is it that makes one competitive? The actual fact of trying to be competitive. Training, investing, educating, and so forth. Right, so Great Britain had a relationship with many of its colonies, where it would receive the raw materials from the colony, transform them into finished products at home using its sophisticated production techniques, and then sell them abroad. The British said to its colonies, the Americans included, you should not establish your own manufacturers because you're not suited to it. Only England is. Some Americans, Alexander Hamilton among them, saw through this specious logic. England is only suited to manufacturing because it has manufacturers. We are not suited to manufacturing because we don't have manufacturers, and so if we did have manufacturers, we too would be suited to manufacturing. The Hamiltonian defiance of the British free trade theory marked a great significance. The British had held an advantage over the rest of the world, using the supposedly invulnerable theory of free trade to tell any of their rivals that it is scientifically proven that you are stupid if you try to establish manufacturing in your own country and thus break the British economic hegemony. The Americans broke the spell, and the Germans soon followed in suit. But why did they want to break into manufacturing? Surely it's nicer to be outside, right, rather than being in a factory. Well, the Americans were resentful of their trade relations with England. Why? Because they produced low value-added goods, shipped them to England, where they were transformed into high value-added goods, and then shipped back to America, where Americans were to buy them. What's wrong with this? Low value-added goods are not very profitable, whereas high value-added goods are very profitable. Americans thus lost out on some of the income they might have enjoyed if they had had their own manufacturers. Plus, they wouldn't have to pay for shipping. They were stuck in low-paying industries, basically. By the way, this isn't exactly a unique situation that America was in. Many countries are currently stuck in low-paying industries. A lot of really poor countries are mostly exporters of raw materials rather than high value-added goods like computer hardware, like South Korea is. And there's a reason for that, is that low value-added industries just are not that profitable, and you can't really build an advanced sort of first world type economy around them. And it's also very difficult to break into high value-added goods industries because, well, they're extremely competitive internationally. So yeah, being stuck in low value-added sectors of the economy is not really a desirable situation. This brings us to more problems in Ricardo's theory. It doesn't account for different categories of goods. Neither does it take into account at all the question of income. Ricardo simply assumed that whatever is produced will be consumed, but he doesn't get into the question of who will be doing the consuming. That question is decided by income, which is conspicuously absent from his theory, meaning that it is only partially complete. And our last point about Ricardo, probably the most important, is that his model doesn't include capital. The production process is merely reduced to a matter of labor hours, which is a major mistake. And again, it may not have been that much of a mistake back in his time, because capital has become increasingly important to the productive process since then. But either way, it's either maladapted to our current economic dynamic, or it's just flat out wrong. In Ricardo's time, one didn't have to worry about capital mobility, because the natural barriers to capital mobility were so high. Immature financial systems, higher language barriers, transportation methods, etc. It was just plain harder. Nowadays, capital is extremely mobile, and probably the biggest thing blocking its mobility is policy rather than the actual costs involved. You have to incorporate capital into your model of trade, and especially capital mobility, in order for it to be complete. Let's take a look at an example. Say you have two countries, Portugal and England, both of which have their own large steel firms. Pretend one day that a tsunami engulfs all of the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel, wiping out all the shipments of steel being made by the two firms. The English government sees this but does nothing, saying the government shouldn't pick winners and losers. The Portuguese government sees this and decides to shelter its steel firm by reimbursing it for the value of the lost cargo. The English steel firm has taken a major loss, whereas the Portuguese one has taken no loss at all. Investors in the English steel firm, now doubting its profitability or even solvency, may disinvest there and reinvest in the Portuguese firm. Now the English firm is unprofitable due to a lack of capital, and the Portuguese firm is doubly profitable due to the new capital. Why did this happen? Because the Portuguese government shrewdly took advantage of the fact of capital mobility and secured the Portuguese steel firm's access to English capital, thus denying the English firms access thereto. So this is a little oversimplified, I'd say, but I think the principle in the example is clear, right? If a firm is unprofitable, then it won't be able to attract capital. If a firm is profitable, then it will definitely be able to attract capital. And since capital is mobile, it can easily leave from unprofitable firms to profitable firms. And also, towards the end of this paragraph, we say the Portuguese firm is doubly profitable due to new capital. We're just saying that the new capital allows it to invest in more sophisticated techniques that allow it to expand somehow. Okay. So what does this mean? Sadly, it means that if there is no profitable avenue for capital within your own country, then the capital will go elsewhere, leaving the industries in your own country underfunded or unfunded. It is thus in the interests of both the government and the citizenry that the large firms of the country be profitable. So while the English were more committed in our example to small government ideals, by letting their big steel firm go under, they allowed capital to relocate elsewhere, which they may not be able to retrieve, thus depriving their own economy of investment funds. It's important to keep this in mind. When a large firm in your country goes under, it is less likely that the capital will be liquidated and reinvested into other firms in your country, and more likely that the capital will be reinvested into other firms in other countries, but of the same industry. Right? So when a company collapses and all of their machinery and their tools are fitted for a specific purpose, those tools can't easily be repurposed towards other industries, but they can easily be bought by foreign competitors and put to the same purpose, but just in a different land. So capital is not perfectly, fungible is the word. Fungible meaning, you can exchange one for another very easily. Capital is a heterogeneous mix of different factors. And so if you have an auto firm and it produces automobiles, and you have a bunch of buildings and machines that are suited towards producing automobiles, and the car factory goes under, then what is going to happen with that capital? Is it going to be used to start making sofas or stoves? No, it's either going to be liquidated, or it's going to be put to use in the car industry, but just with another firm. Okay. So, put another way, without strict financial and trade regulations, a country is not entitled to the investment functions of its own savings. Now, I know that sounds a little bit radical, but the key word here is entitled, meaning without strict financial and trade regulations, you can still expect um, to have a decent amount of your own country's savings be dedicated towards investments in your own country's businesses. But it the country is not entitled, meaning the capitals or the country's stock of capital is not really its own. It doesn't have exclusive right to the capital, or even a privileged right. It has as good an access to its own capital as every other country in the world. So, just to reiterate, without strict financial and trade regulations, a country is not entitled to the investment functions of its own savings. Okay, so just to recap this section of our video, the problems with Ricardo's theory are that it's only really suited to agricultural industries, probably because the economies during the time that Ricardo wrote his theory were more defined by agriculture. The second is it does not incorporate any idea of income, so it's an incomplete one-sided theory. And thirdly, it doesn't incorporate any idea of capital, and is thus unrealistic and unsuited to the modern world of capital hypermobility. What is capital hypermobility? Basically, it just means that capital has very low difficulty in locating itself in a very broad variety of places on Earth, and has a relatively low difficulty in relocating itself. Okay, so who does free trade benefit? In the 19th century, it benefited England, who guarded her techniques and machinery. No one else could manufacture, so them opening up their markets to her was to her great advantage, right? England wouldn't have any foreign competitors, so if it could gain access to all of these markets all over the world, it would basically, well, it wouldn't have a monopoly, but in terms of nation states, I guess that's the best word that we could use to describe the situation. In the 21st and 20th centuries, manufacturing techniques are less of a mystery, and the policy of free trade most benefits whomever doesn't fall for it. If you adopt the policy of free trade, you open up your domestic markets to foreign competitors who are free to bite away your own domestic firms' market share. But they can sell to those other countries, right? Not necessarily. Just because you adopted free trade doesn't mean they did. Likely they adhere to a dirigist trade model, as China and Japan, some of the world's strongest exporters, do, in which the government protects the domestic market from foreign firms and both subsidizes and privileges its large firms in order to increase their competitiveness internationally. Free trade in the modern world is the policy of the greater fool. Other notes about free trade. Free trade reduces demand for all parties involved. This is often coined as efficiency. It has positives, but it also has negatives. Let's see why. Imagine a world of total autarky, meaning zero trade between nations. Each nation must produce its own potatoes, steel, TV, cars, etc., etc. This means that the demand for these materials within each country is incredibly strong, probably so strong that supply cannot keep up, and there are often shortages of everything. Incomes are very high due to strong demand, but so are prices, and the availability of goods in general is quite low. Now imagine a world of total and universal free trade. Now each nation need only produce one or two things while importing the rest. The demand for everything now is quite low, as the world is in a state of general oligopsony for raw materials and capital goods. Oligopsony meaning that there are very few buyers, and so those buyers can basically ask for a very low price, the type of low price that wouldn't exist in a competitive marketplace. This means that prices are very low, but so too are incomes, as none of the markets for producer inputs are very competitive, meaning lots of firms trying to buy scarce goods and resources. This state of oligopsony or monopsony, oligopsony meaning multiple and monopsony meaning only one, this means that as demand for producer inputs is weak, demand in general is weak, and thus demand for labor is weak. So that means that wages would be very low. Neither of these scenarios is very desirable. In the former, demand is strong but supply is weak. In the latter, demand is weak and as a result, production in general is low. Probably lower even than in the former example. Obviously, total inefficiency isn't desirable, but the efficiency of free trade, which is a euphemism for both reduced amount of market agents and reduced systemic demand, is no blessing either. It seems that the best scenario is one with a high availability and supply of goods, but one in which demand is also strong, one that balances both supply and demand. Okay, so earlier there I said euphemism for reduced amount of market agents. What does that mean? Well, in a situation of autarky, each country would have to have its own, automobile manufacturer or computer chip manufacturer or whatever. So, in the state of relative free trade that we have today, there are 187 countries, and maybe, let's say there are 30 auto manufacturers and 30 computer chip manufacturers. If there was autarky, then those numbers would immediately go up to at least 187. Maybe in bigger countries with bigger economies, like America, there would be more than one automobile manufacturer. But what it means is that in autarky, the amount of market agents immediately goes up. And yes, this is inefficient, but as we talked about earlier, it also increases demand universally. Okay. Earlier we talked about the policy of free trade, exposing your markets to foreign competition, and not being able to enter other countries' markets due to their protection, or dirigism. Dirigism meaning the policy of governments supporting big firms with subsidies, protections, privileges, and so on. Each country has its own set of policies in place in order to maintain a certain balance of trade, even if it's not explicitly protectionist. So, yeah, although most governments pay lip service to free trade, they're not, in fact, committed to it in terms of policy. But they're not allowed to put up tariffs and things like that. So they often resort to using informal trade protections, or informal trade restrictions, which that entails a wide variety of methods or policies. But for example, with the Chinese, they just pay people at the docks to not unload certain products into China. So some things just aren't allowed to come into the country. And this isn't necessarily even the policy of the Chinese government, but it's just something that they tell the dock workers to do down there. So, foreign exporters kind of get the idea. Those goods just aren't going to go into China. One of the more popular methods of trade protectionism is actually monetary policy. But we are going to get to that a little bit later. So I like to refer to this situation as the equilibrium of the international political economy. Just as there are price equilibriums, I believe that there are also policy equilibriums, where if a country undoes its trade policies, it will suffer the penalties of capital exodus, unemployment, and worse. In order to understand the equilibrium of international political economy, it's important to understand dirigism and the perspectives behind it. Okay, so this here is a diagram sort of demonstrating the basic principle of dirigism. So here we have a graph of a few different firms categorized by their type of industry. In the center is shown steel, which has the highest number of costs, right? Steel has a bunch of different costs. It has to pay for a bunch of different things. It has to pay for transportation, fuel, mining, technical research, and also things like lawyers and doctors and engineers and just a wide variety of costs. On its periphery are other lower cost firms and other lower cost industries. Just for the sake of argument, we're going to assume that the steel industry is the one with the highest costs. So maybe in real life, producing fuel has higher costs than steel. But we're just going to pretend that steel is the highest costs. So all the other non-steel firms constitute businesses whose products and services make up the costs of the operation for the steel firm. Because the steel firm's costs are so high and so numerous, it stimulates the business activities of many other firms within the regional economy. The steel firm's presence there is highly beneficial because it generates a high level of demand for all the other businesses' activities. This is, in large part, why dirigism exists. It's a French word, by the way. So, French economists realized the essential function of large firms within an economy, not only to produce cost effectively what small firms can't, right? That's our principle of economies of scale, right? Having machinery in a certain, once you hit a certain critical mass, it becomes much more productive than any sort of massive machinery below that level. So, economies of scale. Basically the principle that large firms can produce at lower costs than small firms, especially above a certain point. Let's see. Not only to produce cost effectively what small firms can't, but also to generate demand for all the smaller firms within the economy. The large firm is thus the centerpiece, the engine, the most valuable firm for an economy. Without it, business in general flags. Okay, so this is, here, let's go back. This is the model of a dirigist economy. You have steel at the center. This is a model for a service economy, right? You can look at the graph here. Not really a lot of heavy industry or productive stuff at all really happening. iPhone repair, book mostly just service and retail, right? So sometimes the political and intellectual leadership of America speak of having undergone a transition to a service economy, by which they mean an economy which has reduced its industrial activities as a share of total economic activity and increased service and retail ones. What this really means is transitioning to a lower output economy. Look at the graph above. These are examples of service or retail firms. They generally have low costs, especially compared to something like steel production. Well, what's the problem here? There's nothing to drive expansion or growth in any of them. Here we are missing a true engine, a large, internationally profitable firm, rapacious for business services and business products to make all of its surrounding businesses profitable. When we are in such a situation, with no engines of demand, the economy is stagnant. Profits are lackluster, and thus wages are lackluster, and then profits must again then be lackluster, especially in an economy where so few of the businesses have 4 business products and services, and so many of them have 4 consumer products. What a paradox! What is the point of having all of these consumer businesses if the source of consumer demand, high profits and thus high wages, has been extinguished? Without large and costly productive endeavors, the impetus for economic growth fizzles out, much like a vine that is planted into the ground and not onto a scaffold. The latter grows up, the former snakes around, lost on the ground. So having learned a little bit of the dirigist perspective, and why the nation-state's interest in protecting its large farms is both legitimate and benevolent to the citizenry, we can explore the concept of an equilibrium of international political economy. Okay, so to start. Protectionism is politically unpopular. After having suffered the stigmata of the support of many illiberal regimes, it also has the detriment of being in opposition to Ricardian trade theory, which, although outdated and incomplete, is highly fashionable among the upper echelon of academia and the economic publishing world. The Economist, for example. Taking an explicitly protectionist stance is thus highly unfashionable. This is no problem for either Japan or China, as they are unconcerned with whatever passes for a scarlet letter within Western opinion. They've tried dirigist and protectionist policy and it's worked swimmingly for them. Nevertheless, countries have an imperative to protect the profitability of their companies, either because they are corrupt and paid for by lobbyists representing those companies, or because they realize the legitimate interest of the nation-state in preserving some type of international competitiveness. This difference is significant and will expound on why later. Because tariffs are so unfashionable, other methods are used. Tax credits toward the big companies, subsidies, patent protections, informal, meaning off the books, trade protections, and lastly, inflationary monetary policy. The last one is probably the most disastrous. Why? Well, it's very effective. Devaluing the currency makes your exports more affordable and also closes your domestic market to foreign competitors by making imports more expensive. What's the problem? It encourages everyone to devalue their currencies at the same time, so as not to be the one dunce in the room with an overvalued currency. What is the problem here? Well, everyone's monetary systems are tied up with the banking system. This means that, inadvertently, a nation-state's desire to protect its own markets and increase the profitability of its major exporters is at a high risk of inflating bubbles within the financial sector. Even worse, when all the nation-states feel the need to follow suit. The risk then isn't so much as losing out on an opportunity, which is being the greatest exporter, but on not surviving, being the worst exporter. So nation-states are compelled to conform to a set of policies by the competitiveness of the international market, which is often not only dangerous to them and against their national interest, but dangerous to the entire world economy. Right? We saw this in 2008, the global financial crisis. There's a high degree of exposure between the banking systems of various countries. So often what's bad for banking in one country is bad for banks all over the world. Okay, so look at the state of the world right now. Most countries have gotten to the point of negative real interest rates, and the US buys $80 billion in treasuries monthly. Why? Monetary stability? Maybe. But what about trade stability also? If any of these countries decided to cut it out with all the funny money printing, their domestic market would be forfeit tomorrow, and their balance of trade would turn highly disadvantageous. This is what is meant by equilibrium of international political economy. Just as firms are subject to the pressures of market competition in economic theory, so too are the nation-states of the world subject to the pressures of market competition in reality. That sounds awful. Well, it is. Nation-states have very little sovereignty, so long as they are plugged in to the system of international trade. There are, however, policies which the country can pursue to win back its independence and secure for itself both the usage of its own markets and its own capital. These policies, however, are unfashionable within Western thought to the point of ostracism. Any country that even hints at pursuing them would be lambasted as totalitarian, authoritarian, Stalinist, Maoist, fascist, Hitlerist, and every other dirty name in the book. These policies are taxes on imports, blocks on imports, export subsidies, capital controls, taxes on foreign exchange transactions, and so on. Now, during Japan's post-war period, they enjoyed the political support of the United States under the condition that they remained hostile to communist forces in that region. In return for this allegiance, they themselves were allowed to follow these policies of dirigism and protectionism, as well as free access to American markets for consumer goods. All this despite carrying the banner of America's ideology, which was free market capitalism. Actually, Japan's economy really wasn't free market capitalist at all. It was basically a war economy repurposed for peacetime. Anyways, what was the result? Possibly the greatest explosion of productivity and prosperity within a single society ever recorded in economic history. No doubt it was due to Japanese culture and dedication, but also due to the policies they pursued. And thirdly, but no less importantly, to the fact that America opened up its markets to hers as a sort of diplomatic bargaining chip, exchanging the market share of its own domestic producers, giving that away to foreign producers for an anti-communist diplomacy. This, in fact, has been somewhat of a modus operandi, an MO, for the American government, exchanging market share for diplomatic allegiance. They've done this with Japan, China, and much of post-war Europe. For a long time, this policy was fine, considering the fact that the rest of the world was so devastated that no other economies could pose much of a threat in terms of competition to the American one. Free trade then was not so bad, since we were essentially mimicking the situation of 18th century Britain in terms of trade dominance. Okay, right, so after World War II, when all of European manufacturing was in shambles, American manufacturing was relatively uncontested. So there really wasn't much of a problem with our free trade policies with Europe. Okay. Earlier we touched on the topic of nation-states either pursuing trade policies out of self-interest or at the behest of special interests. It's important to distinguish between the two because they often have effects on what the policy actually turns out to be. In Thatcherite United Kingdom, for example, one of the Thatcher administration's economic goals was to increase the international competitiveness of the English economy, whereas other countries less influenced by Anglo-Saxon individualism would have pursued a path of trade protections, subsidies, private public investment programs, and so on. The Thatcher administration saw that the best way to do this was by outright devaluing labor. This policy may have saved some of England's firms, but it did so at the expense of the English people. This is one way to be internationally competitive, by making your own people poor. But this seems to defeat the purpose of having an economy in the first place, which is to enable a higher standard of living. The other way to be internationally competitive is the path of protectionism and dirigism. What this means is that it is impossible in the long term for a country to both A, pursue free trade, and B, pay high wages to its workers. If it tries to do both, then its firms will not be able to compete internationally. One of three things will happen. Either the state will have to direct protections and supports, labor will have to devalue, or the firm will either shut down or move somewhere else. In the long term, there are no alternatives. There cannot be high wages without high profits, or else the economy itself is consumed in the process. And of course, a company would never decide to allow itself to be consumed, so it will just decide instead to relocate. Okay, well, if this is true, then why was Britain so successful? Well, in the first place, Britain's workers were always poor. They never really did get to a state of high wages. But secondly, I guess I should have added the caveat that one can pursue free trade and pay high wages to one's workers if there are no international competitors. If you are the top dog on the international market and no one poses a threat to you, then yes, I guess this is possible. But like I said, you have to think in the long term. So even for England in the long term, this didn't work because eventually America and Germany wised up and built up their own exporting capacity. So what happens when countries actually listen to economists? With the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia, and other Eastern Bloc countries, were given the challenge of transitioning away from a total state ownership model of the economy and attempting to reintegrate into the international economy. To a T, they followed the advice of Western neoliberal economists. And I don't have anything right here, but basically what it shows is that unemployment for all of these countries soared, and where there wasn't unemployment, maybe there was severe underemployment. For example, in the case of Russia, the underemployment really is not accurately reflected by the statistics, because many companies would just keep someone on the payroll for 1 hour a week just to continue enjoying tax privileges. So the person would be getting paid maybe $5 a week, which is certainly not enough to live on. So this series of reforms passed in the Eastern Bloc and ex-USSR countries was devastating to the standard of living for these people. And not only was it devastating for their standard of living, but it also resulted in a mass dissolution of the working capital of these countries. They used to manufacture a lot of things, but after the neoliberal reform, their capacity for manufacturing was greatly reduced. Much of this capital was liquidated or abandoned, and it was sent off to other countries. Okay, so trade in review. Ricardian trade theory is incomplete because there's no mention of capital, no mention of income, and it only assumes immutable factors in the economy, like the climate or an ineducable populace, when in fact most of the variables in a modern economy are mutable. Like, you can turn an unskilled workforce into a skilled workforce, and you can increase your capital and so on. Right, capital now more mobile than ever. Prices on the international market determined by industrial and trade policy. Alright, so the only way that firms get onto into the international market is by being at a certain size where they can reach certain economies of scale that allow them to compete. And none of them get to that economy of scale without government support or protection, which is often referred to by economists as industrial policy. Industrial and trade policy determined by the impetus to retain capital. So it's really not much of a choice that these governments have. Their choice is to either enact industrial and trade policy or to lose the use of their country's own investment funds. So it's really not a very good choice. This impetus to retain capital, we can call it the equilibrium of international political economy. The results of deviating from the equilibrium of international political economy are either the absolute devaluation of labor or capital exodus and subsequent unemployment. So yeah, the only way that you can keep your plant capital, meaning your capital that's actually entrenched and invested in machinery and buildings, we call that plant capital. The only way that you can keep that in your country is by devaluating your labor. Either that, or it is just liquidated or abandoned, or it just leaves. The unintended consequences of adhering to the equilibrium of IPE. This entails financial crises and other monetary or financial disequilibrium. Right, this happens when nation states depend too much on monetary policy as a method of guiding their trade policies. We can also refer to the impetus to retain capital as capital's veto power. Meaning, if the state does something that capital doesn't like, it will leave. And this is not necessarily limited to total free market reform. So, again, capital's veto power. I think that's an essential concept to take away from this presentation. And what do I mean by that last sentence? This is not necessarily limited to total free market reform. What I mean is that even if a country does pursue total free market reforms, this might not be a sufficient condition for the cooperation of capital within the country. So they might want more privilege or more protection or subsidy than a free market system is capable of granting them. So basically, capital's hypermobility is capital's ability to leave your country and leave your country without income and without production and without an economy. Basically, it's the threat of withholding. So we refer to this impetus to retain capital as capital's veto power, because essentially, if a state doesn't have strong trade, financial, and investment regulations, it's not entitled to its own savings as investment, and so it has to cooperate with capital in order to make things happen. And so ultimately, the bottom line for any economic policy is that the capital can just say no and leave. Okay. What are our prospects for the future? Well, in the United States and in many European countries and a lot of countries on the Pacific Rim, they're considering passing a law called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and this is supposedly a trade deal. In fact, it has a lot more contained in it than just trade legislation. But essentially, what it means for the future, if it gets passed, is more free trade, less of a nation-state's entitlement to its own savings, which means an increased veto power of capital. So it's just, if this happens, it's only going to augment and intensify the mechanism by which capital is able to basically either give the green light or give the red light regarding a country's economic policy. So that would be bad. It would probably mean a labor devaluation in the United States. The naturally lesser capital mobility of the past made trade policy less of a concern. Although America has traditionally pursued a protectionist policy throughout its history. So yeah, I think now, we're basically living in the future, you might say, with sort of the globalized financial system and the ease of communicating across languages and the ease of transporting goods with all of this improved transportation technology has really, I think, brought the trade issue to the forefront. So it's something that has to be addressed now more than ever before in history. And it's especially important that we understand the mechanism of capital's veto power, which is, again, the ability of capital to either green light or red light any economic policy which a country comes up with. Okay, and that's my presentation. Thanks for sticking in there. I know it was a long one, and hopefully you'll go on to the next in the series.